1% so far this afternoon. All right, moving on here. At age 24, Tyler Schultz exposed the $10 billion biotech company Theranos for its fraudulent practices, prompting criminal and civil investigations into the company. Schultz has remained largely unavailable for interviews, but now he is telling his side of the story in his own words. Joining us now is Tyler Schultz himself, Theranos Whistleblower and host of the Audible original podcast, Thicker Than Water. Tyler, great to have you with me here today. What a saga. This story is far from over. You just released the podcast Thicker Than Water. Why have you chosen to speak out now and in the form of a podcast?
Yeah, so, my story has been told a few times through the Wall Street Journal, through the book Bad Blood, and in an HBO documentary. But this is my opportunity to tell my own story in my own voice. And in a lot of these other mediums, it sometimes felt like I was reading about a character in a book, and I wasn't really reading about myself. So this was just a great opportunity for me to give listeners a better idea of what it was like to be in your early 20s and going through this.
Yeah, Tyler, I mean, I've consumed all of that content. This story just so emblematic of the problems within Silicon Valley. What were the main things that you wanted to talk about that you think weren't covered in all the content that is available about the story? Was it mostly on kind of the emotional toll and the decisions that you had to make internally when you decided to speak out?
Yeah, a lot of it was on the emotional toll. It's the facts have been out for a while now. So now this was just a way of me kind of connecting like a personality or like a human to those facts and what it was like to go through the decision-making processes for the various decisions that had to be made, and just what it was like emotionally to go through it.
Tyler, let's talk about some of those decisions you had to make. You had hard evidence that the product, the Edison, didn't work as it was intended, but what was at stake for you? What kind of decisions were you making when you were decided whether to speak out or not?
Yeah, so, there were a lot of impasses where I could have, quietly left the company, or I could have spoken up. I could have contacted federal agencies, or I could have let it go. I could have not spoken to the Wall Street Journal, or I could have helped that reporting. I could have gone on the record, or I could have just stayed in the background, deep background source the whole time. But kind of like each time, it almost felt like it was a sneeze that I could not hold in. It was like a compulsion that I was so bothered by these practices, and I was just so fed up with these bullies that I just felt like I had to stand up for myself, and I had to expose Theranos and Elizabeth and their lawyers and whatever else.
Tyler, I wonder if there was kind of a turning point for you, because there were countless deceptions by the company itself, claims that the machine could run hundreds of tests with a single drop of blood. Was there something that was especially egregious to you of the essentially lies that were being proliferated?
I mean, there were some really big lies. So probably the biggest was that, they said they could do anything that a central laboratory could do in a single drop of blood. In reality, they could only test one thing at a time. So if you ordered 300 blood tests, that would have needed to be run on 300 different devices. And then it also wasn't even a standalone product. So you had to use other products before you could use the Theranos product. And then it didn't even work. So pieces like the tips inside the device were constantly falling off. Variations were extremely high. I was convinced that we were not giving accurate results, which is the biggest problem, in my opinion. And then later, we've learned from the SEC report that there was an instance where Elizabeth told investors that her revenues the previous year was $100 million, and in reality, it was $100,000. So the lies were that big. They were so big that they were almost beyond questioning.
And Tyler, you faced, a lot of pushback, obviously, from Elizabeth Holmes, from Sunny Balwani through all of this. At one point, you had said that you thought you were being followed by investigators. What was it inside of you that made you keep pushing and keep trying to expose these lies, even though, to your point, there was a lot at stake for you and you could have just quit and not said anything?
Yeah. I don't know exactly what it was inside of me. I got to give a lot of credit to my parents. Whatever they did, I think it worked. But kind of like I said before, it was like a compulsion. Even though when I spoke to my parents, they were right in telling me that there was nothing I could gain from this. It was a huge risk, no reward situation, and I would do it anyway. It was like almost irrational. But I'm really glad that I did it, for sure. Things worked out well for me. I'm proud of what I was able to do, as are my parents.
Tyler, do you think this story would have gone unexposed if you hadn't spoken up, or were there others with similar concerns as yourself?
No, there were tons of people who had the same concerns that I did. And in the, in the medical device community, I think most people already knew. Like when I went to my next job, I interviewed with the COO, and they said that they had a stack of resumes this high from people who were trying to leave Theranos. And then I went and sat down for lunch, and there was someone who said, "Oh, you came from Theranos? If I had a board like that, I could lie forever too." So it was not really a big secret in the medical community, but I think it was in the, in the larger community.
Yeah, Tyler, what is your best guess as to why this huge lie was able to exist for so long? There have been hypotheses of the charisma of Elizabeth Holmes, investors just being excited about a female founder, about the promises that she was making. Why do you think it was able to go on for so long and reach a $10 billion plus valuation?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think Elizabeth was just very charismatic. She was very convincing. She had a great story, and everyone loves a good story. The lies were so big that you wouldn't possibly think that they were not true. And she was really good at just evading any kind of questioning or due diligence. She was able to raise hundreds of millions of dollars, and not a single investor ever saw an audited financial statement. That's incredible. That's really astounding. And then when they did this deal with Walgreens actually hired someone who was an expert in laboratory science to go do due diligence on the technology. And Elizabeth wouldn't show him the technology, so he went back and said, "Don't do business with them." But they did business with them anyway. So she was just really good at evading the tough questions.
Tyler, obviously a very critical time, especially now for biotech companies racing to find a vaccine for COVID-19. What words of warning do you have for investors, for consumers, for analysts on, the risks of having these biotech companies kind of racing to find a solution in light of what you learned at Theranos?
Yeah, so it's no secret that we're in a really tough spot right now. We need solutions quickly. But the problem with developing solutions too fast is that you have to cut corners. The regulations are lower. So it really allows for opportunities for fraud or just for mistakes to be made. And on the diagnostic side, we've already seen those mistakes be made. So my hope is that the people who are developing the vaccines and the therapies are able to look at what happened in diagnostics and make sure that they're doing good science, that they're moving fast without cutting too many corners.
Tyler, thank you so much for your time, and thanks for continuing to share this story. Tyler Schultz is the Theranos Whistleblower and host of Audible original podcast, Thicker Than Water. Thank you again.